The dust swirled, a choking, gritty shroud clinging to the parched throats of the onlookers, yet none so much as Ilara's. It was the taste of her own degradation, a flavor she would never forget, no matter how many years or miles sought to cleanse her palate. Before her, the town of Redemption Gulch, a cruel irony of a name, sprawled under the merciless sun, its citizens a collection of hardened faces and hungry eyes. Not hungry for food, no, but for spectacle, for the breaking of another spirit. On the crude wooden platform, little more than a repurposed wagon bed, she stood, barely a woman at 17, her calico dress torn at the shoulder, her dark hair matted with the grime of days spent captive. Her hands were bound before her, the rope biting into her wrists, a constant reminder of her helplessness. Silas Blackwood, a man whose shadow seemed to cast a perpetual blight on the town, paced before her like a preening rooster, his voice a booming, greasy thing that coated every word with possessiveness. "Step right up, gentlemen. A fine piece of property, this one. Young, strong, barely used." His laughter, a harsh bark, echoed off the false fronts of the general store and the saloon. Ilara's gaze, initially wide with terror, a wild, trapped animal's panic, swept across the crowd. She saw the leering grins, the cold assessments, the flicker of pity in a few women's eyes, quickly extinguished by fear or indifference. Her eyes locked for a moment with Sheriff Brodis. He stood near the edge of the platform, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered Colt, his face a mask of discomfort, a sheen of sweat on his upper lip. He looked away first, his gaze dropping to the toe of his dusty boot, and in that instant, something within Ilara fractured, then fused into a core of unyielding iron. The last vestige of girlish hope died, replaced by a cold, burning ember of resolve. Blackwood was extolling her virtues, the strength in her back for labor, the supposed docility of her spirit, a spirit he and his cronies had systematically tried to crush since her parents, good, honest folk, had succumbed to the fever, leaving their small holding and a trumped-up debt Blackwood claimed as his own. "Who'll start the bidding for this prime filly? $10? Surely she's worth more than a tired mule." A rough-looking man with piggish eyes and a stained beard, a freighter by the looks of him, grunted, 12 another, a gaunt prospector, cackled, 15, if she can cook. Blackwood's smile widened, his eyes, like chips of obsidian, glinting with avarice. 15 it is. Do I hear 20? The bidding was slow, agonizing. Each offer was a fresh lash, each assessing stare a violation. Ilara focused on a crack in the platform wood, tracing its jagged line with her eyes, pouring all her fear, all her rage, into that tiny imperfection. The final bid came from a hulking brute named Jebediah Thorne, a man known for his cruelty to his livestock and his quick temper. $50. And she better be worth every damn cent. Blackwood's gavel, a stout piece of wood, slammed down. Sold. To Mr. Jebediah Thorne. Ilara's head snapped up. Thorne was already lumbering towards the platform, a greasy smile splitting his face. As he reached for her arm, his fingers like sausages, Ilara's voice, raw and surprisingly strong, cut through the sudden quiet. "I will remember this. I will remember every face here. Every word." Every silenced her eyes, burning with an intensity that made even Thorne pause for a breath, swept over them all one last time, searing their images into her memory. Then, she was yanked from the platform, a choked sob escaping her before she bit it back, her chin held high even as Thorne's rough grip bruised her arm. The dust rose behind them as she was dragged away, not towards a home, but towards a new, deeper hell. The last thing she saw of Redemption Gulch was the way the sun glinted off Sheriff Brodis' badge, a star of shame in a firmament of cruelty. And in the silence that followed her departure, the only sound was the wind, whispering through the desolate streets, carrying the faint, almost imperceptible echo of a vow forged in the crucible of utter despair. 12 years. 12 years of suns rising and setting, of seasons turning, each one a testament to survival, to a will that refused to be extinguished. The town of Redemption Gulch lay nestled in the same dusty valley, seemingly untouched by the passage of time, like a wound that had scabbed over but never truly healed. Silas Blackwood was older, his hair thinner and shot with grey, but his arrogance remained, a familiar stench that clung to the town's very foundations. He still ruled, his greed a cancer that had metastasized, choking the life out of any true prosperity for the common folk. Then, as the dawn painted the eastern bluffs in hues of apricot and rose, a figure appeared on the high ridge overlooking the slumbering town. A lone rider, cloaked and still, like a sentinel carved from the ancient rock itself. The silhouette was lean, the posture erect, radiating an aura of unwavering purpose. This was Ilara. The sun had etched lines around her eyes, eyes that now held the wisdom of winters and the hardness of flint. The girl who had been sold was gone, consumed by the fires of her ordeal, and from those ashes, a woman had risen, tempered and formidable. She raised a gloved hand, a slow, deliberate movement. Behind her, cresting the ridge in disciplined silence, came others. 10, then 20, then 70. A diverse company, fierce native warriors, their faces painted for a purpose she alone knew, weathered plainsmen who had seen too much of the world's injustices, and women, too, their eyes reflecting a similar history of trials overcome, each a testament to Ilara's journey, to the alliances she had forged in the wilderness of her exile. They carried rifles, bows, and a quiet menace that spoke louder than any war cry. Down in Redemption Gulch, the first stirrings of alarm rippled through the awakening streets. A boy, sent to fetch water, saw the figures on the ridge and ran back, his voice shrill with terror. Doors creaked open, heads emerged, eyes squinting against the morning light, then widening in disbelief and dawning fear. Silas Blackwood, roused from his bed in the town's largest house, a monument to his ill-gotten gains, scoffed at the initial reports. Indians? Raiders? Nonsense. Probably just a lost hunting party, but as more townsfolk gathered, their murmurs growing louder, their faces paling, even he was forced to the window. His bloated face tightened. He didn't recognize the leader, not at first, but the sheer number, their silent, organized presence, sent a cold sliver of unease through him. Sheriff Brody, his face now a roadmap of regrets and too many sleepless nights, felt a jolt that had nothing to do with the morning chill. There was something in the way the lead rider sat her horse, a certain stillness, a familiarity that clawed at a deeply buried memory. His hand, gnarled with age, instinctively went to the colt at his hip, the same colt he had worn 12 years prior. His fingers trembled slightly. He remembered a girl's eyes, burning with a promise of retribution. Could it be? The town was surrounded, a silent, unyielding perimeter. No demands were made, no shots fired. Just the waiting. The sun climbed higher, baking the fear into the very soil of Redemption Gulch. The 70 warriors were statues, their presence a suffocating weight, a question hanging in the air, sharp and deadly as a drawn arrow. What did they want? Or rather, who did they want? The silence itself was a torment, each tick of the clock in the sheriff's office amplifying the dread. Brody stared out his window, the reflection of his own haunted face superimposed over the distant, implacable figures. The past had come calling, and it had brought an army. The sun beat down, turning the dusty main street of Redemption Gulch into a furnace. The silent vigil of Ilara's warriors continued, an oppressive weight that had ground all normal activity to a halt. Doors remained bolted, windows shuttered. Children were hushed, their frightened whimpers absorbed by the thick tension. Around mid-morning, a lone rider detached from the formidable line on the bluffs and began a slow descent towards the town. It was a woman, straight-backed and stern-faced, her dark braids adorned with a single hawk feather. She rode unarmed, her hands resting calmly on her saddle horn, yet her presence exuded an authority that made the few brave enough to peek from behind curtains shrink back. She stopped at the edge of town, her clear voice carrying in the unnerving stillness. I carry words from Ilara, she who was once sold from this place. She demands Silas Blackwood, and all those who bid for her flesh or laid hands upon her in bondage that day. Deliver them to the clearing by the old sycamore before the sun touches the western ridge. If you fail, the price this town pays will be far dearer than 50 pieces of silver. The messenger turned her horse and rode back, leaving her ultimatum hanging in the air like the scent of brimstone. Panic erupted. A babble of voices rose from behind closed doors. The town council, a collection of nervous merchants and anxious elders, convened in the back room of the general store, the air thick with fear and stale tobacco smoke. Mayor Thompson, a portly man whose jowls quivered with agitation, wrung his hands. Blackwood! We must give him up. It's the only way. But others, men who had benefited from Blackwood's tyrannical reign or were simply too terrified of his local power, hesitated. And what if she's bluffing? One whispered. What if Blackwood's men can fight them off? Silas Blackwood himself, when confronted by a trembling delegation, was apoplectic. His face turned a dangerous shade of purple. Give me up? To that stray bitch? I made this town. I own half of it. She's nothing. A ghost. Her and her band of savages will scatter at the first sign of real steel. He slammed a meaty fist on his mahogany desk, rattling the expensive trinkets he'd amassed. I'll see her dead before I bow to her. Sheriff Brody sat in his office, the messenger's words echoing in his mind. Ilara. The name was a phantom limb, an ache of a memory he'd tried to amputate for 12 long years. He saw her face again, not the hardened visage of the woman on the ridge he now suspected it to be, but the terrified, betrayed girl on that cursed platform. He remembered the desperate plea in her eyes, a plea he had ignored, choosing self-preservation, choosing the path of least resistance. The weight of that choice had been his constant companion. He recalled the whispers that had followed her sale to Jebediah Thorne's sudden disappearance a few months later, his remote cabin found ransacked, Thorne himself never seen again. Some had said she'd killed him and fled. Others, that Thorne, in a drunken rage, had finally met his match in the unforgiving wilderness. No one truly knew. Brody now suspected the truth was far more complex. This woman, Ilara, had not merely survived, she had gathered strength, allies, a purpose. The 70 warriors were not a random band of marauders, they were a testament to a journey through hell and back, a legion forged in shared suffering and a common thirst for justice. Brody's gaze drifted to the wanted posters on his wall, images of men far less dangerous than the woman who now held the town's fate in her hands. Blackwood, meanwhile, was not idle. He summoned his coterie of hired guns, rough men loyal only to his coin. They were bullies and thugs, effective at terrorizing unarmed townsfolk, but their mettle against seasoned warriors was untested. Blackwood, blind with arrogance, saw only a challenge to his authority, an affront to his inflated sense of self. He would not be dictated to, especially not by a woman he had once deemed mere chattel. The hours ticked by, each one a tightening knot in the stomach of Redemption Gulch. The sun arced across the sky, a relentless eye judging their indecision. The shadows began to lengthen, stretching like accusing fingers across the dusty, deserted street. The deadline was approaching. Blackwood and his dozen or so gunmen had fortified themselves in the Golden Gulp saloon, its batwing doors now barred, its windows dark save for the glint of rifle barrels. He had offered drink and bonuses, his voice loud and blustering, trying to project a confidence he perhaps no longer fully felt. The air in the saloon was thick with bravado, whiskey fumes, and the metallic tang of fear. Outside, the town held its breath. Ilara, watching from the ridge, saw no sign of compliance. Her face, impassive as granite, betrayed nothing. As the sun's lower limb kissed the jagged line of the western bluffs, she raised her hand. There was no thunderous charge, no volley of arrows. Instead, a small group of her warriors, moving with fluid grace, descended and, with practiced efficiency, diverted the small creek that fed the town's water troughs and wells. Another group set a controlled fire to a deserted, dilapidated barn on the far outskirts of town, the smoke a stark plume against the vibrant sunset, a visual promise of what could befall the entire settlement. It was a psychological siege, designed to fray nerves, to demonstrate capability without immediate, widespread bloodshed. Panic flared anew in Redemption Gulch. The mayor and his council made another desperate plea to Blackwood, their voices cracking. He responded with curses and threats, firing a shot into the ceiling of the saloon to emphasize his refusal. A few of Blackwood's more nervous men, seeing the discipline of Ilara's forces and the growing desperation of the townsfolk, began to whisper amongst themselves. This wasn't the easy fight they'd been promised. Sheriff Brody had watched it all, a storm raging within him. 12 years of shame, of looking away, had led to this. He saw Ilara, not as a vengeful spirit, but as an instrument of a terrible, righteous judgment. He saw Blackwood, not as a town pillar, but as the rot at its core. The memory of her eyes, young and pleading, then old and resolute, burned away the last of his fear, the last of his inertia. He unpinned the tin star from his vest, the star that had come to symbolize his compromise, his failure. He looked at it for a long moment, then dropped it onto his dusty desk with a soft thud. He walked out into the street, unarmed, his shoulders straighter than they had been in years. He walked towards the Golden Gulp, the townsfolk peering from their windows, wondering if the old lawman had finally lost his senses. He pushed through the bat-wing doors, which Blackwood's men had foolishly left unbarred from the inside, assuming no townsman would dare. Silas, Brody's voice was quiet, but it cut through the nervous chatter in the saloon. "This ain't about land or money anymore. This is a reckoning. You brought this storm down on all of us." Blackwood, a bottle in his hand, his face flushed, spun around. "Brody! You lily-livered old fool! Get out, or join these curs in defending what's mine." He gestured with the bottle towards his gunman. "This town is mine. She was mine." Brody shook his head slowly. "Nothing and nobody belongs to you like that, Silas. Not anymore." He turned to address the townsfolk who had gathered timidly behind him, drawn by the confrontation. "She's not here to destroy this town, not if we show we're better than we were. She's here for justice. For what was done to her. And for what we all stood by and let happen." He then turned back to Blackwood, his eyes steady. "Silas Blackwood, by the authority of, by the authority of what's right, I'm placing you under arrest." Blackwood roared with laughter, then his face contorted in rage. "Arrest me? You senile old bastard!" He lunged for the shotgun propped against the bar. One of his men, quicker on the draw, leveled a pistol at Brody. Before he could fire, an arrow, seemingly from nowhere, hissed through the air and embedded itself in the gunman's shoulder, making him scream and drop his weapon. Simultaneously, figures moved in the twilight, Ilara's warriors, exploiting the chaos Brody had created. They didn't storm in like a wave, but flowed like water, disabling, disarming, their movements precise, economical. The fight was short, brutal, and surprisingly one-sided. Blackwood's hired guns, mostly bluster, folded quickly against disciplined opponents who fought not for coin, but for a cause. Ilara herself appeared in the doorway as the dust settled, her gaze fixed on Blackwood, who now stood alone, his bravado shattered, his eyes wide with a fear he'd never shown before. "You sold a girl, Blackwood." Her voice was low, devoid of shrill emotion, carrying the weight of years. "Today, a woman collects the debt." Her eyes, cold as winter stars, held no mercy, only an unwavering, terrible clarity. The dawn that followed was somber, heavy with the weight of impending judgment. Blackwood and a half-dozen of his most loyal cronies, those who had actively participated in past cruelties or bid on Ilara, were bound and held under the watchful eyes of her warriors. The remaining townsfolk emerged from their homes, drawn by a mixture of fear and a grim curiosity, gathering in the main square. They watched as Ilara directed her people to bring the captives to the very spot where she had been auctioned, the crude wooden platform still standing, a decaying monument to the town's shame. Silas Blackwood, stripped of his fine coat, his face bruised and his eyes darting about like a trapped rat, was shoved onto the platform. He stumbled, his arrogance replaced by a pathetic, trembling fear. He looked out at the faces in the crowd, faces that had once revered or feared him, now looked upon him with a mixture of contempt and terror for their own uncertain fate. Would Ilara enact a blood vengeance? Would she burn Redemption Gulch to the ground as a pyre for her suffering? The silence was thick, broken only by Blackwood's ragged breathing and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Ilara stood before the platform, not on it. She was no longer the victim. She was the arbiter. Her weathered face was unreadable, her eyes scanning the crowd, then settling on Blackwood. He tried to speak, to bluster, to beg, but the words caught in his throat, a choked whimper. Then, Ilara spoke, her voice clear and carrying to every corner of the square. 12 years ago, on this spot, a life was stolen, a soul was bartered like cattle. Many of you watched. Some of you partook. All of you were silent. Her gaze swept across the townsfolk, and many flinched, dropping their eyes in shame. You built a town on the silence of fear, on the acceptance of cruelty. You allowed one man's greed to become your law. She paused, letting her words sink in. The air was electric. I could take an eye for an eye. I could give you the same mercy you showed me. A murmur of fear rippled through the crowd. Blackwood began to visibly shake. But what would that make me? Another tyrant, ruling by fear. Her eyes found Sheriff Brody, who stood amongst the townsfolk, no longer wearing a badge, but standing taller for it. Justice is not merely vengeance. It is a cleansing. It is a chance to build anew. She turned back to Blackwood and his cohorts. You will not die here today. Death would be too quick a forgetting. You, Silas Blackwood, and these men who eagerly followed your path of cruelty, will be stripped of every ill-gotten gain. Your lands, your properties, will be forfeit, used to aid those you've cheated, or held in trust for a true community. You will be exiled from these territories, marked so all will know your crimes. You will wander, with nothing but the clothes on your backs and the memory of what you've done. You will know what it is to have nothing, to be nothing. Her warriors moved then, not with violence, but with grim purpose, escorting the condemned men away, their journey into ignominy beginning immediately. Elara then addressed the remaining townsfolk. This town stood silent once. It watched a soul be broken. Today, it has witnessed accountability. Tomorrow, she looked towards the horizon. Tomorrow, Redemption Gulch can choose to live up to its name. The choice is yours. The fear is gone. Build something worthy of the name. With that, she turned. Her warriors, their task completed, began to mount. Sheriff Brody stepped forward. Elara. What you did? Elara met his gaze. There was no warmth, but perhaps a flicker of something akin to understanding. What I did, Sheriff, was finish what started here 12 years ago. The rest is up to you. And she mounted her horse, her movements fluid and sure. She did not look back as she and her 70 warriors rode out, not towards the harsh wilderness that had forged her, but towards a future she would now define on her own terms. They became smaller figures against the vast expanse, disappearing over the same ridge from which they had arrived. Redemption Gulch was quiet. The sun climbed, promising a new day. The townsfolk looked at each other, the silence no longer one of fear, but of profound contemplation. A heavy burden had been lifted, but a new, more profound responsibility had settled in its place. The air felt cleaner, the future uncertain, yet for the first time in a long time, tinged with a fragile, nascent hope. They had been given a harsh lesson, and a precious, second chance. The redemption of Elara was complete, not in fire and blood, but in the hard, clear light of justice and the possibility of a new beginning for others.